Welcome to Eastern Europe's Minorities in a Century of Change, a podcast on the history of minority experiences in Central and Eastern Europe during the 20th century. I'm Dr. Samuel Foster, co-organizer for the Bassi Study Group for Minority History. This series is part of the Institute of Historical Research's centennial commemorations, Our Century, Looking Back, Thinking Forward, and has been organized by the study group. It was made possible through the help and support of the Bassi Association of Slavonic and East European Studies and the Stanley Burton Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Leicester. The study group is a forum devoted to researching minorities in the national and regional histories of Central, Eastern, and Southeast Europe and promoting closer scholarly collaborations. For more information, please visit our website at studygroupforminorityhistory.com. In this episode, we're joined by Rok Stergar, Associate Professor at the University of Ljubljana and a historian of the Habsburg Empire, the First World War, and nationalism in the Balkans and Central Europe, to discuss the history of minority relations and civil administration in what is today Slovenia. We'll be focusing especially on this area's final years as part of Austria-Hungary and the situation that immediately followed its union with the Kingdom of Yugoslavia at the end of 1918. Rok, welcome to the podcast. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself and how you became interested in this area of history?
Hi, you've already mentioned that I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Ljubljana and that I'm a Habsburg historian. And basically, most of my research is really focused on the Habsburg era and especially on the history of nationalism within the Habsburg Empire. This is what I've been doing for a while now, and most of my publications are on that topic. But I've also been doing, as a side project, in a way, some World War I history, mostly focusing on soldiers' experience during the war. Again, focusing on the Habsburg Empire and on the Habsburg soldier experience. And as I was working on that topic, I came across some of the sources that suggested that the prevailing narrative about the post-imperial era, the narrative that still prevails in the Slovene historiography, lacks some nuance, let me put it like that it needs to be re-evaluated, that it needs to be revisited, that we need to look at these post-imperial years from new perspectives and using new sources as well. And as the centenary of World War I was coming to a close in 2018, it seemed to me that everybody was basically moving into this post-imperial era, and there was a lot of calls all of a sudden for conferences, workshops, and I pragmatically decided that I should do something about this, that I should actually use the sources that I've gathered while I was working on World War I history, and then I applied for a few conferences, and a few publications eventually came out of that. So I kind of stumbled into post-imperial history, into this historiography of post-imperial transition in a way, but it's been a fascinating experience, and I think that there's still a lot of work to be done. So I'm currently actually focusing on this era and on this topic the last few years. So the Habsburg history has been pushed to the side a bit.
Just for the benefit of our listeners, where is Slovenia? Who were the major ethnic and national groupings in 1918? And what had been the territory's political and social status within Austria-Hungary prior to the First World War?
Yes, Slovenia is an independent state since 1991 and has been a federal republic in Yugoslavia since 1945. It is situated between Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Croatia, so it's a part of Central and Southeastern Europe, or basically borders both, or Yeah, well, yeah. There are some discussions that the borders of the Balkans run through Ljubljana, the capital of Slovenia. But we know that those borders are actually very hard to define. So this is another debate altogether. Anyways, before 1918, Slovenia as such did not exist. It did not exist as an administrative unit, except, of course, in the imagination of Slovene nationalists. The territories that they claimed for themselves within the Habsburg Empire were parts of several Austrian crown lands, the Austrian littoral, Carniola, Carinthia, and Styria, and there was a tiny bit of territory that Slovene nationalists sometimes claimed for themselves in the other part of the Habsburg Empire, in the other part of Austria-Hungary, that is in Hungary itself. But again, these lands existed as Slovenia only in the imagination of Slovene nationalists. They claimed since 1848, this was basically the mainstay of Slovene national program, they claimed a united Slovenia. They wanted to have a separate province within the Habsburg Empire, a separate province called Slovenia, but they never came close to realizing that the crown lands remained as separate administrative units, so there was no Slovenia in that area. Of course, this entire development can be situated within this larger debates about reform in the Habsburg Empire, where several different groups proposed federalization of the empire based on national groups. But of course, that never happened on the imperial level as well. So Slovenia remained just a figment of nationalist imagination for the most part. Although it has to be said, the empire, of course, recognized Slovenes as a separate nation. The empire recognized the Slovene language as one of its official languages. So it was used in administration, it was used in education, and Slovenes again were recognized. Slovene speakers were recognized as one of the groups within the empire that had its rights, that had the right to use its own language for the most part. But of course, if we look at this imagined Slovenia before 1918, it was not just Slovene speakers who lived there. There was a sizable German-speaking community, mostly in urban areas, but not only in urban areas. In the littoral, of course, there was a large Italian-speaking community, especially in Trieste, which the Slovene nationalists claimed for themselves, although it had an Italian-speaking majority. And this easternmost part that was a part of Hungary had a sizable Hungarian-speaking community. There was Roma, of course, as well, but this was a rather small, numerically speaking, a rather small group, and it wasn't active in politics. It did not have its own nationalist movement, so it was mostly neglected when it came to politics, when it came to political debates, when it came to visions of future.
And did the Great War itself precipitate any significant changes in how these Slovene-dominated territories were administered?
Well, the start of the war brought huge change to the empire, to Austria-Hungary, but mostly actually to its Austrian part, to so-called Cisleitania. Whereas in Hungary, the parliament still functioned and the government still was responsible to the parliament. The freedom of the press was still in force. In the Austrian part, the government basically dissolved the parliament and introduced what we could call semi-authoritarian rule in the Austrian part of the empire. The freedom of the press was severely curtailed. Some laws were put in force that basically curtailed several additional civil liberties. People were being sent to jail or interned if there was not enough evidence to sentence them to jail. And the army increasingly played a role in the administration of the Austrian part of the empire. So civilians were, to a large degree, pushed to the side, especially in those areas that were close to the front. There, the army basically ruled on its own, and it ruled often. Its rule was quite brutal. The army, the officers saw treason, that it saw they saw prisoners everywhere, and there was actually executions of civilians suspected of being spies. There was this so-called spy craze. So it was a rather brutal period, especially in the eastern part of the empire, in Galicia, where the Eastern Front was, and of course in the southeast, Bosnia, parts of Croatia, which lay along the Serbian border, the Serbian front. One of the reasons why this happened is that, of course, as the army mobilized, it also mobilized reservists. It mobilized a lot of reserve officers, and when we are talking about the army in 1914 and afterwards, we are basically talking about a huge number of civilians being mobilized. And a lot of them were, as civilians, they were previously already nationalists. And if you look at the numbers, statistically speaking, some of them, or many of them, were German nationalists. And this played a role in these so-called Slovene lands. You previously had, on the political level mostly, you had this so-called nationality conflict between the Slovene and the German nationalists. And now, all of a sudden, you have these German nationalists in the army as reserve officers who can use their role to send their political enemies, if we could put it like that, to jail. And this really did happen. But the situation started to change first in 1915, when there was when Italy entered the war and a new front opened. Then the army itself, but also the civilian authorities, started to look for allies in a way, and the Slovene population looked as one of those potential allies. There was the idea that you could motivate them to fight against Italy, because of course the famous or infamous London Agreement, which promised huge swaths of territory to Italy in exchange for its entry into the war. And of course, some of these territories were territories that the Slovene nationalists saw as theirs. So the idea was that you could basically do a deal with the Slovenes, that you could motivate them to fight the Italians, which really did happen. And because of that, the army started looking at this regime that was put in force in 1914, that was put in force after the outbreak of the war. And some of these policies were actually changed. This brutality was toned down somewhat, but not only because of that. The other reason was that some of the civilians, some of the officials started telling the government and the army that this is not a good way to administer the state, that this is actually counterproductive, that this is going to produce unwanted results. So this brutality was slowly being toned down even before the Italian entry into the war. And then the big change came after the death of Francis Joseph in 1916. The new emperor made significant changes. Most of the most oppressive measures were abolished. The parliament was convened again, and as the parliament reconvened, parliamentarians, MPs started asking questions, and there were several commissions of inquiry actually that looked into this regime, this semi-authoritarian rule after 1914, and found out some of the things that I already mentioned. For example, that these reserve officers, some of them nationalists, abused their positions to settle scores in a way.
And what were the immediate post-war consequences for Slovenia's minorities following the actual collapse of Habsburg authority in the autumn of 1918? I'm thinking especially of this German-speaking minority group.
Yeah, I already mentioned that Slovene nationalists were demanding this united Slovenia ever since 1848, but they always imagined it, or most of them at least, imagined this Slovenia within the Habsburg Empire. They wanted to reform the Habsburg Empire, not destroy it. But this starts to change during World War I. Part of the reason for this change were the things I was just talking about, this semi-authoritarian rule that changed the atmosphere. All of a sudden, it appeared to Slovene nationalists that they were somehow not really partners in this state, that they are not equal partners. So they start looking for alternatives. And especially in 1917 and then in the early part of 1918, as it became increasingly clear that the Habsburg Empire is going to lose the war, and that the Entente has now decided to dismember the empire, which was not one of their goals as the war started. It was still not their goal at the beginning of 1918. But as the summer came in, it became increasingly clear that the Habsburg Empire will not survive the war. That's why they increasingly start looking for other solutions. And one of them was, of course, the idea of a Yugoslav, South Slav nation state. And this is what happens in the autumn of 1918. They proclaim first on October 29th, they proclaimed the independence of the state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, which comprised only those provinces of the Habsburg Empire where the South Slavs lived. But this state was never internationally recognized, and it was unable to control most of its territories. The situation was basically untenable. So they quickly unified with Serbia. That happened on December the 1st, 1918. So from then on, we have the state that is officially called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes until 1929. And the Slovene and the Croat and the Serb nationalists who founded this state saw it as a South Slav nation state, and of course this had consequences for those inhabitants, for those citizens actually who were not seen as South Slavs, as Yugoslavs. It was pretty clear from the very beginning that they will be tolerated at best. They became minorities. This is actually a new term that only starts being used after 1918. And the Germans, the Hungarians, the Italians, and several other smaller groups across Yugoslavia now became minorities, which were, as I've said, tolerated at best. There were, of course, international agreements that secured some of their rights, which did not always help that much in practice, but there was some laws and agreements that protected their rights. But on the other hand, you have a series of legislative and practical measures from the very beginning, basically, aimed at homogenizing the population. On the one hand, the nationalists always suspected that large parts of these minority populations, people who used German language or identified as Germans, were not proper Germans, quote unquote, that they were actually originally of Slovene, people of Slovene descent who were forcibly Germanized by the previous oppressive Habsburg government, quote unquote, of course. And the idea was that they will come back to the fold, basically, that they will eventually recognize that they are actually Slovenes or Croats, that they are actually Yugoslavs, and that they will cease using these other languages, German or Hungarian, that they will cease identifying as Germans or Hungarians and become full-fledged Yugoslavs. There was, of course, also measures aimed at those people that the authorities, that the nationalists didn't see as lost members of the nation. Those they targeted with several measures, and basically the goal was to push them out, to make them leave the country this way or the other. So the whole idea is, as it often happens with nationalists, that this nation state should include all the members of the nation, the Yugoslav nation, and nobody else. So Yugoslavia after 19 always functioned as a nationalizing state. So trying to homogenize population as much as possible.
So just turning then to your 2020 article, which where you've sort of cover this topic in more detail, you describe the changes that occur at a more sort of local administrative level during this early post-imperial transitional phase as having effectively amounted to a series of purges. Now, this is a term that today carries very violent and anti-democratic associations. Particularly, we tend to think of what takes place in the 1930s in the Soviet Union under Stalin. Thinking about it, but going back to sort of 1918 and these early years, then, what sort of rationale or narrative do you think these new nationalist authorities were using to justify their aggressive stance, particularly against the German speakers? And alongside that, what kind of national ideological lens do you think they presented this through? Was it, say, a sort of localized Slovene one, or wider Yugoslavia one, or maybe even a combination of both?
It certainly was a combination of both, because for a long time, ever since Slovene nationalism came into existence, Slovene nationalism and Yugoslav nationalism were in a way inseparable. There was always the idea that being Slovene was a precondition of being a Yugoslav. So you first have to be a Slovene, but then at the same time you are a Yugoslav as well. This was also the idea across Yugoslavia that most nationalists shared at that particular moment. So this is a nation, a Yugoslav nation, but it has three separate tribes, as you well know, Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. So you are not, you cannot simply be a Yugoslav. You basically have to, I am simplifying here quite a lot, but you simply have to be a Slovene, a Croat, or a Serb first, and by being a Slovene, a Croat, or a Serb, then you are already at the same time a Yugoslav. So this was the things that were happening in 18 and later on were informed by this thinking. Later on, things start to change. There was a move toward this integral Yugoslavism, as it's often called, where you don't have these separate identities that altogether comprise this Yugoslav identity, and you only have the Yugoslav identity. But this was not the case at the very beginning in 1918, 1919. I mean, some nationalists already suggested that this should be the way forward, but this was a minority opinion, at least in Slovenia it was. So moving back to these purges, as I call them, and they were, well, I wouldn't say necessarily violent, but they were certainly anti-democratic. Because actually, although some of this was done in a legal way, there was this authoritarian tinge to it from the very beginning. Anyways, the rationale that was behind all these moves, the sacking of hundreds of officials and also teachers and others who were categorized by the new authorities, by the new Slovene Yugoslav authorities, as foreigners, as in a national sense, because they were citizens actually of Yugoslavia. So they were categorized as Germans and or Hungarians, as non-Yugoslavs, and they were being targeted because the idea was that the nation state must have a national administration, that the a national education. So schools have to educate these kids in a national sense. They have to make Yugoslavs out of these pupils, and this, of course, can be only done by proper Yugoslav teachers. And these people need to be administered by officials belonging to their own nation. There was one additional rationale, or better said, probably excuse that they used. They often presented, the new administration often presented Germans and later also Hungarians as former oppressors. So this purge that was introduced in 1918 already was being presented as a kind of liberation, you know. So we are getting rid of those people who were oppressing us for centuries, of course, as the story went, and we are finally delivering a national administration to our people who deserve to be governed by their own people.
So then, moving just beyond what you've described as being a, well, what we should probably consider as being still a rather elite administrative sphere. What were these, for want of a better term, purges, repercussions for the wider non-Slovenian German community? I'm thinking particularly of those who weren't actually involved in politics.
Yeah, I mean, if we stay with the administrative structures first, it has to be said that these people were not only sacked, that they didn't only lose their jobs, but some of them had to leave their apartments as well. So they were targeted in various ways. But the officials were not the only ones who were targeted. As I've already mentioned, the idea was to nationalize everything. Everything has to be Yugoslav. So not just the administration, but the schools, the cultural institutions, the civil society, as well as the media. One of the first things that happens in Ljubljana is that the semi-official daily newspaper of the previous administration, Laibacher Zeitung, which was published in German, ceased its publication on the very next day. after the declaration of independence. And similar things were happening elsewhere in other towns as well. But if we look at these several areas that I've already mentioned, education, for example, several schools that were now categorized as minority schools. So this in Slovenia, this predominantly means schools for the German-speaking pupils were simply closed. There was a lot of pressure being put on parents to enroll their kids into Slovene classes, into Slovene schools, and the new administration had rules about these minority schools that stipulated that you have to have a certain number of kids enrolled in those schools in order for them to keep functioning, to keep existing. And of course, because of this pressure, some schools simply didn't have enough pupils anymore, so they were closed. And it has to be stressed, this was not these were not primarily voluntary decisions by the parents. Some of them changed their mind. They recognized that the situation has changed, that Slovene is now all of a sudden more useful than it previously was. The German perhaps might not be as useful as it previously was. So they enrolled their kids into Slovene speaking schools, but a lot of it was actually pressure by the local nationalists, but by the government as well. So this is one of the things that happened. Teachers were also fired. Teachers teaching in those German language schools, or teachers categorized as Germans, were fired in their hundreds. And that wasn't all that was happening. And this is something that also continued throughout the interwar period. Basically, all these minority schools, although there were international agreements and there were Yugoslav laws that ensured their continued existence, but in practice there was always pressure being put on these parents, on these kids also, not to enroll into a German-speaking or a Hungarian-speaking school, for that matter. But that was not the entire story. Institutions of civil society were also put under pressure. Several societies, clubs were dissolved pretty quickly after independence was proclaimed. Some of them were, as they called it, nationalized. So they were transformed, forcibly transformed into Slovene institution. The rather famous Philharmonische Gesellschaft from Ljubljana was basically dissolved, and its archives, its buildings, all that it accumulated throughout its existence was basically given to competing Slovene institution. The German-speaking theater, drama theater in Ljubljana was also basically stopped functioning pretty quickly because it couldn't anymore, and several other institutions that some of them existed for not only for decades, but some of them actually existed for centuries, simply could not function anymore. They were either dissolved or unable to work further. There was also changes in politics on the local, especially on the local level, where, for example, in this Slovene part of Yugoslavia, several hundred municipal councils were dissolved. The government decided that this municipal council is illoyal, that it has too many German councillors, that it has a German minority, so it was simply dissolved. Mayors, for example, who were categorized as German or as illoyal, were replaced by government commissars. So you have this rather forceful politics again aimed at nationalizing the not just the population, but basically the structures that kept the state going. Furthermore, you had plans for forced immigration. I already mentioned that this homogenization was one of the policies of the Yugoslav state. And if you look at Slovenia, you have reports from district captains from the local level with long lists of those who were categorized as citizens of an enemy state. But in practice, that meant mostly Germans. Some of them actually were Yugoslav citizens, not Austrian or German citizens. And the plan was to basically force them across the border. It never came to that, but the plans were being made, which is important to know. On the other hand, it has to be said that there were, despite all that I've already described, a lot of continuities, not just when it comes to the legal and administrative framework, which remained Austrian for in some instances for decades to come, and virtually unchanged, but also if we look at the administration, the schools and other institutions, you see that, for example, some of the people categorized as Germans were not fired because they were needed. So you have on one hand, you have this ideological zeal, but on the other hand, you have this pragmatic approach. One of the ministers of the national government in Ljubljana acknowledged that the judiciary would have simply collapsed if they had fired all the supposed Germans immediately after independence. So they kept them in their posts because they most of all, of course, needed for the state to function. Some of those officials that were first fired as Germans were then immediately basically rehired because they again needed policemen, they needed judges, they needed prison wardens, they needed those people. And in some parts of this new state, you didn't have anybody else but those people that you saw as foreigners, as potential enemies. But they were also, on the other hand, capable people that were well educated, that knew how to work in a judiciary, in an administration, so you needed them. And so on the one hand, you have these breaks, sometimes quite radical breaks, and on the other, you have these continuities that go on in some cases for decades.
How did these changes affect Slovenia's non-German minorities, such as Italians? Were there any other groups that were targeted as harshly during this, or what you obviously described, very turbulent political period?
I already mentioned that there was Roma in the territory that was now included in Yugoslavia, but this was a group that was basically neglected when we come to this to these policies we were just talking about. I mean, there were no Roma working in the administration or no Roma teachers, as it were. So they were not especially targeted. This is a special story that still needs to be told. But if we look at the other groups that now all of a sudden became minorities, the other one that is, besides the Germans, that is important, that was sizable, were the Hungarians actually after 1919, because you had, of course, a lot of Italian speakers in the littoral, but the littoral was occupied in 1918 by Italy, and was then officially became a part of the Italian kingdom after the Treaty of Rapallo, which fixed this new border between the Yugoslav and the Italian state. So you don't have a sizable Italian-speaking minority in the Slovene part of Yugoslavia. you do have an Italian-speaking minority in the Croatian littoral, but this is, and similar things were happening there, but this is a different story in a way. So if you just look at, if we are just looking at Slovenia, you have the German-speaking minority, which is rather large. And then you have the Hungarians after 1919, because Yugoslavia only occupied this easternmost part of present-day Slovenia, which is now called Prekmurje, and which was previously a part of Hungary in 1919, when Yugoslavia intervened in Hungary along with Romania and other states against the Bela Kun, the communist regime of Hungary. And in return, basically, Yugoslavia got this part of Hungary. And there were several thousand Hungarian speakers living there. A lot of these administrative posts were occupied by Hungarian speakers. Hungarian-speaking teachers were numerous, and basically the new authorities, when they occupied this region, which was then later formally given to Yugoslavia by the peace treaty, took almost identical steps to the ones I described previously. So they fired the officials that were categorized as Hungarian, kept some because they needed them. They started looking at the schools and started firing teachers, but again, keeping some, mostly those that they saw as potential Slovenes and Yugoslavs, people who were, quote unquote, previously forcibly assimilated into the Hungarian nation and could now return into the fold. Institutions again were targeted, dissolved, nationalized. So basically what we see in this region, in Prekmurje after 1919, is pretty similar to what we saw in the rest of Slovenia and Yugoslavia after October 1918, after independence had been proclaimed. Again, this group had some rights. Some schools in Hungarian language still functioned. There were international treaties that guaranteed some of their rights, but there was always pressure being put on these people. And if you see at the statistics, you see the numbers declining rather rapidly after 1918 and after 1919, of Germans and Hungarians as well. Some of that was actually assimilation, or at least statistical assimilation. So people, when it came to the census, they would say that they identify as Slovenes or Yugoslavs rather than Germans or Hungarians. But some of that was actually people leaving, Hungarian speakers or German speakers leaving for Austria and for Hungary, because for all sorts of reasons, those that I described and several more, they decided that they simply have no future in this Yugoslav state.
And finally, where can people go to learn more about this topic?
I've mentioned that this post-imperial transition is a, how should I put this, a hot topic the last few years, and there is a lot of literature on it. Even if we just look at the this post-Habsburg space, there are names I'll mention. I will surely forget some more. I hope people don't hold this against me. But for example, if you look at the whole empire, but especially its Hungarian part, you have Gábor Egri, a historian from Budapest, who has an ERC project on exactly this topic, on post-imperial transitions on the local level. And he and his group have published a number of chapters articles on this post-imperial transition from several perspectives, not just about the things I was talking about, not just about the purges and the breaks, but also about continuities. Then, if you look further at Czechoslovakia or former Bohemian lands, you have several publications by Rudolf Kučera and Ota Konrad, some of them in English as well. They look at the Bohemian lands, but also at the larger region, not just at Czechoslovakia. In their latest book, they also look at Austria and actually South Tyrol as well, which became a part of Italy after the war. Then you have, for example, Marco Bresciani, who has been working on Trieste in this post-imperial, post-World War I era, looking at the birth of fascism in this region and at the larger developments that influenced the birth of a special breed of fascism in this region. And all of this he's doing in this post-imperial framework. Then you have, for example, a brilliant book by Dominique Reil on Fiume after the war, this city-state that existed for a while and that is best known for the escapades of Gabriele D'Annunzio immediately after the war, but Dominique does not look at that. She looks at how the people experience this transition from one empire into a short-lived city-state and then into another kingdom, the Kingdom of Italy. There's also, for example, interesting work by Jakub Benes on green cadres and the rural unrest in some of these post-Habsburg regions. And this is an extremely important topic, I feel, because one of the things I have been missing from this existing often slightly nationalist narratives about the post-imperial transition was this was the other revolution, if we put it like that. This is the social revolution that was, of course, always somehow in the air. The possibility of a revolution was always there. I mean, not just the possibility. If you look at Hungary, there was a proper Bolshevik revolution there. If you look at Munich for a short while, you have a Bolshevik, a Soviet state there for a while. So this was something that was happening across the region, and there is some research on that, but I think that more is needed. And finally, and I left a lot out, I surely have. If we go back to the topic we started with, this is the administration in transition. There's a great volume edited by Peter Becker and Theresa Garstenauer and a few others with a brilliant title, Hofratsdämmerung, that looks at the officials in the post-Habsburg states in this immediate post-World War I era from several perspectives. It has several interesting chapters that look basically at continuities, but also at breaks from different perspectives. And as I've said, it includes most of the former Habsburg lands. So there is a lot one can read, and one should if one's interested in these topics, but there's also a lot that still needs to be done.
Rok Stergar, thank you very, very much.